Okay. Can you hear me now? There's an echo? Okay, let me fix that. Okay, what about now? Is that better? Is the echo gone? Still an echo? You're echoing yourself. Okay. You think that's better, Connie? All right. We're going to go ahead and get started. Um, I've got the reverb thing down as far as I can get it. So, um, you're right, Julie. I don't think they want to hear this part. Um, because we're going to be exposing, I think, kind of the hand behind the hand in this section. Um, Still echoing. I don't know. Alright, so now that's supposed to make it gone. Is that no, that's not gonna be better. How about that? Is that better? Okay. Alright. That's what happens when you have one of these boards that you don't know anything about how to make it operate. Is that better for you, Julie? No, it's not better? Or no, we don't have one, not better. Okay. Let's see. Audio cut out. How's that? Is that better? Do you have a sound now? How about now? Is that better? Here you are. Oh my gosh. All right. All right, we're pressing ahead. Um, Chapter 12, The Empire's Ancient Sin City of London. So the part that I want to make clear here is this. I posted a link about Inslaw. So I don't know if y'all know about the software promise. It's basically spelled promise without the E, Promis. So a company by the name of Inslaw created a software that they wanted to sell to the Department of Justice to its specific reason for existing was to detect money laundering. Okay. So very, very important to anyone who doesn't want criminal money laundering to occur. The Department of Justice basically, in a nutshell, it's very long. You can click on it and read it if you want. They stole the software from Inslaw. Inslaw sold them, sued them. They eventually lost the lawsuit, but at that point, it didn't matter because the Department of Justice had taken their software, given it to the CIA and to Mossad, both of which created backdoors to it. And the backdoor that Mossad created, uh, people assume that's the same thing with the CIA, but it allowed them to money launder without being detected by anybody else, but they were able to see everybody else money laundering. So In other words, it was the perfect tool to blackmail everybody in the drug trade with, everybody in illegal activity with. So it was very, very important to the whole criminal activity on the Inslaw side of the house. So the the ones who had the modified version of it. Also, how this ties to things that are happen that we have experienced. Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell's dad, was the salesperson for Mossad of Promise Software, modified by the Mossad. So there's a lot of speculation that either he was taken, because they were afraid he was gonna talk off his boat and he didn't actually die on the boat, or drowned or whatever, or that he was murdered because he knew too much. But this all has everything to do, so when we talk about the money laundering in this chapter that we're gonna talk, I want every one of y'all to have fresh in your mind the, like, mid-90s when Inslaw developed this software could have been avoided. Every bit of it could have been cleaned up if these people, both in the political apparatus, because there were 2 congressional investigations into the Inslaw incident. So every single person in Washington, D.C. understood what this was and what they were doing with it. And they also understand that every single aspect of money laundering as it facilitates drug trafficking, human trafficking, weapons trafficking could have all been stopped. So just keep that simmering in the back of your mind as you get pissed off as I read all this stuff or talk about all this stuff. So, um, starting off with the book, eventually the Islamic banking movement, and keep in mind we've already talked about BCCI. So, which was a bank in Pakistan. You have the exporting of political Islam, but also an instrument in sponsoring terrorism is the money aspect of it. So, there's a book called Islamic Finance in the Global Economy. Imram Ward, who wrote the book, is quoted as saying, "Op the Islamic banking apparatus, quote, operates more out of London, Geneva, and Bahamas than it does out of Jeddah, Karachi, or Cairo." And I'm gonna stop right here because I want y'all to understand that's huge. That should all be in bold letters. What we have learned is that it's the fascist round table people that created the whole concept of Gladio, the stay behind units, and the financing behind it that is pulling the strings. It is just made to look like something else. And so this point is critical. The financing of terror, the money laundering, is controlled in London, Geneva, and the Bahamas, not in the Middle East. That's true with Hamas. That's true with any crap that's going on in Iran. That's true with any crap going on in Afghanistan. Quote, even Islamic republics have on occasion openly embraced neoliberalism. In Sudan between 1992 and the end of 93, economic minister Abdul Rahim Hamdi, a disciple of Milton Friedman, and incidentally a former Islamic banker in London, did not hesitate to implement the harshest free market remedies dictated by the International Monetary Fund, according to free market rules, because this is how Islamic economies should function. That was what this Hamdi was quoted as saying. So, unquote. Perhaps the best case study of this is the BCCI. It was founded in 1972 by Agha Hassan Abedi. He was a Pakistani financier, but the bank, BCCI, while headquartered in Karachi and London, was actually registered in Luxembourg. Ah, Europe. A decade after opening, BCCI had over 400 branches in 78 countries. They were the seventh largest private bank in the world, and they had over $20 billion, according to their cookbooks. In 1980s, investigations into BCCI in, indicated that they were involved in massive money laundering, illegal activities, using secrecy to gain control of U.S. major bank called First American. BCCI was also found guilty in illegally buying American Bank, the Independent Bank of Los Angeles. They used a puppet Saudi businessman to be the owner of it, and it was found that it was illegally purchased. And Afghanistan offered the opportunity for BCCI to migrate the lucrative heroin business from Southeast Asia, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, to the Pakistani Afghan border under the cover of destabilization, which is why we have wars. And which is why coming up all over Facebook, all over Twitter, you're going to see that stinking poppy picture of it representing something having to do with Veterans Day. I want y'all to spit on everybody that posts that and tell them to stop it. That is a insult to every single military person that has ever served. We are not represented by poppies. If you want to post that on the CIA page, post it on their page. They're the poppy people, not us. Just a little rant, sorry. Brzezinski, who was Carter's uh, guy, planned to use Afghanistan to lure the Soviet Union into its own Vietnam and then lied to the public about it when they fell into the trap in December 1979. And we've talked about that. The destabilization kills two birds with one stone. It weakens the Soviets. This is him saying this. Um, it acts, oh, sorry. This is Paul Fitzgerald's book, The Valedictorian, saying this. Quote, it acts as a cover for moving the heroin business out of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia to a safe haven in the Pakistani frontier with Afghanistan, a trade that propped up the British Empire financially for over 100 years. And keep in mind, we know this to be true because where did Britain go to war 3 times? Afghanistan. Where did they go to war 2 times? China. All about opium. So post that on the British Embassy's Twitter feed and Facebook page. U.S. Ambassador to Afghanistan, Aldous Dubs, Dubs, was assassinated just 7 months after taking his post in Afghanistan under extremely suspicious circumstances on February 14th, 1979. So, investigators in the United States and UK determined that BCCI had been set up deliberately to avoid centralized regulatory review and operated extensively in banks' secrecy jurisdictions. Its affairs were extraordinarily complex. Its officers were sophisticated international bankers whose apparent objective was to keep their affairs secret, to commit fraud on a massive scale, and to avoid detection. That's according to our author. Also, the City of London has been using this type of situation or setup for centuries and presently operates to a diabolical perfection via the City of London. And we'll get into it in a little while about how the way it's set up, the City of London allows this to occur. There's no way a solo Pakistani financier even if he was financed by the Sheikh of Abu Dhabi, which he was, and Saddam Hussein used BCCI as well, could rise to the level of global influence that BCCI did in 10 years without a lot of help from a lot of people. In July 1991, a Manhattan grand jury indicted BCCI on 12 counts of fraud. Now, keep in mind what was going on in 1991. Uh, Desert Storm, right? 1990, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. And if they all knew, which they would, that BCCI was under investigation, do you not think that they would create a war to hide all of this crap? So while they're being investigated, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. That's his personal bank. That's where he hid all of his money. So we've got in July 1991, in the middle of Desert Storm, a Manhattan jury indicting BCCI on 12 counts of fraud, money laundering, larceny, and the Manhattan DA's Walter Morgenthau. We've come across his name several times. He is quoted as saying the quote, the largest bank fraud in world financial history, unquote. Do you think they won't go to war to hide that? You'd be wrong. The actions of the US can best be understood in the context of the Anglo American Empire, with Wall Street operating as an extension of the City of London and Geneva. The disastrous foreign policy of, namely, Britain and the US on the War on Terror crusade has been exposed multiple times. Those very governments who have been shouting the loudest about Islamic extremism and stability in the Middle East are the very ones weaponizing, training, and funding the terror groups, which we have proven unequivocally in this book and the other books that we've been reviewing. The Muslim Brotherhood, Al Qaeda, ISIS, all of them, all funded and created by these same people. It is meant to impoverish and destroy national sovereignty of people, not only in Southwest Asia, but also to slowly kill our own economy and our own people and our own freedom, as we have seen. It's the gift that keeps on giving. Operation Gladio. Western countries are extremely unable to provide a proper standard of living, mass unemployment, lack of health care. She goes on and describes what the fallout of these forever wars are in ruining all of the country. Western government has chosen to pump trillions of dollars into wars that are not only fund the destruction of entire nations, but also provide vast resources for the global drug, arms, and sex trafficking trade. That's all this is, money laundering. The dirty money then circles back to London, Geneva, and the international bankers. A select class has existed and thrived for centuries in this loop. Nobody has benefited from the war on terror except for the global elite, the international syndicate, as I call it. The author spends quite a bit of time on the HSBC. And for those of you who don't know, the HSBC is the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank that was created. And she'll get into it a little bit. I just want to give you the bottom line up front. It was created by England when they began doing opium trade in China. In 2012, there was a record-breaking year for bank fraud. 2012. Oh gosh, isn't that in the middle of Obama's fiasco? Yes, it was. HSBC paid the largest fine ever paid under the Bank Secrecy Act of $1.9 billion, but the LIBOR scandal would occur a little over a week after that. The Swiss bank UBS had to acknowledge its key role in perhaps the biggest antitrust price fixing case in history, the LIBOR scandal, a massive interest rate rigging conspiracy involving hundreds of trillions of dollars in financial products. Journalist Matt Taibbi, how about that? Described it as, quote, "The LIBOR scandal, which is at the heart of the UBS settlement, makes Enron look like a parking violation," unquote. Both HSBC and UBS settlements tied for the gold medal on the biggest financial scam of all times. HSBC is a 19th century British opium bank that was created with its headquarters in Hong Kong, Shanghai, as part of the British conquest of China after it lost both opium wars. China created to facilitate, um, not that, not China, sorry, created to facilitate Britain's trade in opium, something that it continues to be implicated in today. HSBC began to make unfavorable headlines when in 2003 it was ordered by US regulators to strengthen its anti money laundering practices and agreed to fix the problems. Instead, they took part in the most notorious episode in money laundering history. Keep in mind, 2003 is after the mid 1990s when they had promised software and knew all about this. As the Mexican drug war metastasized in the mid 2000s, HSBC provided essential US dollar denominated accounts to narco gangs who needed to clean hundreds of millions of dollars in drug earnings. I have said this all along. MI6, CIA, Mossad, Germans BND, all of the intel agencies are all holding hands. The narco gangs, the cartel, all of this, the terror organizations, all work for them. They're all working together against us. 2010, HSBC was given a cease and desist court order from the US Office of Comptrollers of the Currency. HSBC again promised to make good on its anti money laundering systems. And let me just point out that during this time, the Office of the Comptroller will come up a couple of times. It only changes hands like every 20 years or so. It's not like an appointment that is made every time an administration changes. And I looked up the one that was around in the mid 2000s. That guy, his name is David Walker. He was appointed by Clinton, and he's a Brookings guy. So, again, part of the network. 2012, and let me just also point out here as we read through the rest, because this is going to get a little, I want you to understand the concepts of what's going on, but I also want you to understand these fines. I looked up several of them and where they go. They basically do not help the person. Maybe 10% of the fines collected actually go to the people. But we learned that some of the fines go to the Consumer Protection Board, which was a DNC ran operation where they were funding under consumer protection advocacy groups, Soros groups. So all of these fines is just another way of um, money laundering. They're fining money laundering and using the fines to money launder. That's how insidious this is. Because if you start looking at these fines and where they go, it's like this rabbit hole that's its own podcast in and of itself. So it provides a write-off to the and no one goes to jail. Very few of these people ever go to jail. The heads of every one of these organizations should be forever on, some island away from, like, Siberia, kind of a sentence. But none of them ever go to jail. They just go get another job. They may give a couple of, sacrificial lambs up to go to jail. The big wigs never go to jail. 2012, the U.S. Senate investigative panel released a 339-page report on HSBC's work with the Mexican narco gangs and its role in terrorist financing. How much you want to bet there's not a reference to CIA anywhere in that report? The Justice Report and HSBC reached their deferred prosecution agreement. That that's crap. At the end of that year. HSBC was penalized $1.9 billion, the largest fine under the Bank Secrecy Act for violating four U.S. laws designed to protect the U.S. financial system. HSBC has allegedly laundered at least $881 million in drug proceeds through the U.S. financial system for international cartels, as well as processing an additional 660 million. And this is just what they found. This isn't everything for banks in U.S. sanctioned countries. The U.S. bank subsidiaries failed to monitor more than 670 billion in wire transfers and more than 9.4 billion in purchases of physical dollars from its Mexico units. Prosecutors declined to seek an indictment of HSBC, but instead allowed it to pay a $1.9 billion settlement. Lanny Brewer was the assistant attorney general at the time, and he stated HSBC is being held accountable. No, they weren't. For stunning failures of oversight, and worse, that led the bank to permit narcotics traffickers and others to launder hundreds of millions of dollars through HSBC subsidiaries and to facilitate hundreds of millions more in transactions which with sanctioned countries. HSBC agreed with the DOJ that it would serve 5 years of probation during which its efforts to prevent money laundering would be monitored by a court appointed watchdog. The court named a former top New York State financial crimes prosecutor, Michael Cherkaskey, Cherkaskey. Both HSBC and U.S. authorities have vigorously fought to keep Cherkaskey's monitoring report secret. Now, okay, so we're not going to have a court case, and we're not going to expose their wrongdoings to the light of day. Then, when we pay to have an investigation done, the U.S. authorities fight with the people that are guilty to keep the information from you. In 2019, BuzzFeed News sued for the release of Cherkaskey's final report, arguing that the public's interest in understanding the government's handling of the HSBC case demands that it's unsealed. Spencer Woodman wrote for the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists in 2019 that, quote, the Department of Justice continues to fight to keep the Cherkaskey report sealed and has sought repeatedly to delay preliminary hearings, citing the coronavirus pandemic. The suit is pending, unquote. It was later revealed that George Osborne, the former chancellor of the Exchequer, EXCHEQUER, had intervened to persuade the U.S. government not to pursue criminal charges against HSBC for allowing terrorists and Mexican drug dealers to launder millions of dollars. The congressional report published letters and emails from Osborne and the Financial Services Authority officials to their U.S. counterparts, warning that launching criminal action against HSBC in 2012 could have sparked a financial calamity. We have a financial calamity. The financial calamity they're talking about is them losing their ass. The House Financial Services Committee report said that the UK interventions played a significant role in ultimately persuading the DOJ not to prosecute HSBC. So tell me that we are not still a colony of the City of London. Go ahead and make that argument for me. During the prosecution trial, HSBC acknowledged that for years it had ignored warning signs that drug cartels in Mexico were using its branches to launder money. It's why they were there. A CNN Money article in December 2012 compared the $1.9 billion fine to its $16.8 billion profit. Hey, I'll make that deal every day. I'll pay 2,000 billion if you're going to give me 17 billion. Barroso, a former HSBC anti-money laundering director, told company officials in an exit interview that he was concerned about the civil and criminal sanctions and that there might be allegations of 60% to 70% of laundered proceeds in Mexico going through HSBC affiliates. Again, it's the only reason they're there. They set up these places everywhere that they grow the poppy or that there is a major segment of drug trade that's going to deal in money, whether it's at the producing end, whether it's at the handoff to the cartels to carry into the United States. Um, then whoever they're dropping it off to pays them in cash. They bring it back to Mexico. They got to have a place to put it. These people set all of these branches up to do exactly that. HSBC had ignored links to terrorist financing among its customers' branches, including Riyadh, Al Jazeera Bank, which had ties to terror groups through its owners, according to a Senate report. HSBC decided to cut ties with the bank before reversing itself under pressure from the Saudi Arabia Bank, which received shipments of $1 billion in cash from HSBC U.S. operations from 2006 to 2010. Gosh, I wonder how they got that cash over to Saudi Arabia. I'm sure it was not on military aircraft. HSBC, a U.S. unit, HSBC's U.S. unit, quote, offers a gateway for terrorists to gain access to U.S. dollars in the U.S. financial system, unquote. That was in the Senate report. Also, HSBC has a legal obligation to take responsible steps to ensure that it's not dealing with banks that may have links to facilitate terrorist financing. It's the whole reason they're there. How do you take steps to not do something that's your entire mission of doing? It's just laughable. HSBC was set up to peddle opium. Part of peddling opium was to fund the Sabine units, which create the terror. It's the whole thing, the reason they're there. HSBC links as a facilitator of terrorist financing connected with Saudi banks in February of 2006. Again, the Office of Comptroller of the Currency under President George Bush, which is still a Clinton appointee, suddenly decided to release HSBC from its cease and desist order. In other words, HSBC had basically violated its parole 30 times and got away with it. The bank was, to use the term, off paper and free to let the Saudi banks of the world come rushing back in. Because it's why they're there. Matt Taibbi writes for Rolling Stone magazine, quote, after HSBC fully restored its relationship with the apparently terrorist-friendly Al Rajhi Bank in Saudi Arabia, it supplied the bank with nearly $1 billion in $1 billion US dollars. When asked by HSBC what it needed all of the American cash for, the bank said that Saudi Arabia people need it for all sorts of reasons because they go on vacation. Not kidding. HSBC too big to jail prosecution agreement with the US Justice Department wasn't the only big news that happened in 2012. Matt Taibbi writes, quote, but the Justice Department wasn't finished handing out Christmas goodies. A little over a week later, Lanny Brewer, same guy we just talked about, who was the Assistant Attorney General for HSBC 2012 case, was back in the front of the press giving a cushy deal to another huge international firm, UBS, which had just admitted to a key role in perhaps the biggest antitrust price fixing case in history, the LIBOR scandal. Brewer and the Justice Department worried aloud about the global stability as they explained why no criminal charges were going to be filed against the parent company. Well, UBS has been involved in money laundering for a very long time. And also, just so that you know, this Lanny Brewer guy was part of the Bill Clinton administration and part of the Obama administration as the guy that's in charge of the criminal division. So that tells you all this crap's going to continue to happen. December 19th, 2012, the Justice Department essentially let the Swift banking giant UBS off the hook after it being involved in the biggest financial scam of all times. He also writes about Matt Taibbi does, about the LIBOR scandal, um, saying that many of the world's biggest banks, including UBS, Barclays, the Royal Bank of Scotland, got together and secretly, rigged the interest rates. That's what basically the whole thing was about, and it basically his bottom line at the end was, in banking terms, they juiced the system, and so, I think she just adds this while it doesn't necessarily have to do with it's just to implicate and to illustrate how broad the financial, scams are, not just related to Gladio and money laundering, but they're everywhere. The U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission issued 5 orders filling and settling charges against Citibank, HSBC, JP Morgan, the Royal Bank of Scotland, UBS, collectively for attempting manipulation of and aiding and abetting other banks' attempts to manipulate the global foreign exchange benchmark rates to benefit positions of certain traders. The orders collectively imposed 1.4 billion in civil monetary penalties, specifically 310 million each for Citibank, and then she goes on and lists the amounts for the different banks. Again, more fraud um, going on at each time. Um, in July 2016, the U.S. Department of Justice charged 2 executives, both British citizens, from HSBC Bank over an alleged $3.5 billion currency scheme, which defrauded HSBC clients and manipulated the foreign exchange market to benefit themselves and their bank. Mark Johnson, a senior British banker of HSBC, was arrested in New York City for currency benchmark rigging. He was later convicted of 9 counts of wire fraud and conspiracy to defraud related to front running the currency trades of HSBC clients and sentenced to a mere 2 years in federal prison. He was released after serving 3 months and then allowed to go home while it was on appeal. November 2020, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear the appeal, which was previously upheld by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. It meant he would have to return to the U.S. to serve his sentence. In February 2021, a judge ruled that Johnson would not need to report to prison until he was vaccinated against COVID-19, the gift that just keeps giving to the criminals. It appears thus that Mark Johnson has not had to return to prison since his initial release 3 months after he was incarcerated. And January 6th, people still in jail. But if you defraud people for billions of dollars, no problem. Get that COVID-19 vaccine. Stuart Scott, who was HSBC's European head of foreign exchange trading in London until December 2014, was accused of the same crimes as Mark Johnson. A warrant was issued for Scott's arrest, but he successfully fled to Britain. he must have been tipped off. July 2018, the High Court of Justice ruled against extraditing him to the US because we only want Julian Assange. We don't want the guys who are actual criminals. Since most of the alleged crimes took place in Britain, and because Scott had no significant connection to the US, except he was here doing the crimes. Britain was has no desire to proceed with these investigations because they're going to implicate the apparatus in the City of London. My words. 2015, the UK Financial Conduct Authority had fined 5 banks, the biggest penalty in the history of the City of London at the time, for failing to stop their traders manipulating the market. November 2012, it was reported that HSBC had set up offshore accounts in Jersey for suspected drug dealers and other criminals, and that HM Revenue and Customs had launched an investigation following a whistleblower leaking the details of a 700 million allegedly held in HSBC accounts in the Crown dependency. So that's another reason why British loves having their empire, because they use the empire as basically offshoring money laundering. 2013, HSBC Holdings appointed former U.S. Deputy Attorney General James Comey and ex-UK tax chief Dave Harnett to a panel to combat financial crimes after the bank paid $1.9 billion settlement in 2012 for the money laundering. The Senate committee and lax oversight by top HSBC executives gave terrorists and drug cartels access to the U.S. financial system. Comey was a non executive director at HSBC from March to September 2013. A day before the settlement, HSBC appointed Robert Warner, WERNER, previously head of the U.S. Treasury Department's Foreign Asset Control and Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, as head of a group Financial Crimes Compliance and Group Money Laundering Reporting Officer. James Comey would resign from this position 6 months later to become the director of the FBI. So, just so that y'all know this, there are people that think James Comey's whole um, act, if you will, was an act, and that if you guys have ever read into Operation Grey Lord, the sting that went down in Chicago to bring down a bunch of their criminal activity, um, you could make the argument based on the fact that he sat on boards of some of the most egregious military industrial complex companies and some of the positions that he held. You could certainly make the argument that he would be able to have dirt on people. Whether that's true or not, I'm just telling you, there are some people that think that. Um, I don't know. And I stay away from those types of things because I don't know. Um, but having him inside of the tent of the one of the biggest money laundering drug apparatuses that support Operation Gladio, if you were going to take down the whole system, that would have been a crucial place to be. Leaked records show that HSBC processed at least $31 million between 2014 and 15 for companies later revealed to have moved stolen government funds from Brazil, and more than 292 million between 2010 and 16 for a Panamanian based organization branded by US authorities as money launderers. So we're now into 2015 and they're still money laundering. In 2015, HSBC was ordered to pay a record 40 million Swiss francs and was given their final warning by Geneva authorities for organizational deficiencies, which allowed money laundering to take place in the bank's Swiss subsidiary. The settlement meant that Swiss would not prosecute HSBC or publish their findings of their investigation into the money laundering, announcing the biggest financial penalty ever imposed by Geneva authorities. They launched a stinging attack on his own country's financial laws, one of the guys involved in it, and he had a growing voice in Swiss politicians and campaigners for calling for reform of their secretive banking system. So, again, you have more companies, or HSBC specifically, getting fined, which um, all of these reports all end up being secret. And I have to believe, based on what we know um, about the intel agencies' role in the money laundering and the drug trade, that's the reason why none of them can get released, because they would tell you who's doing the money laundering, and it's our intel agencies. So I wanted to read this one little bit down here. This is from Spencer Woodman. HSBC moved vast sums of dirty money after paying record laundering fees. FinCEN files probe reveals Europe's largest bank aided massive Ponzi scheme while on probation over ties to drug kingpin. Just can't make it up. So this author keeps using the word banks too big to jail, as opposed to being too big to fail, because they definitely would fail if they went to jail for what they were doing. Um, you could have an airtight case proven culpability all the way to the top of the bank's organizational structure, and it wouldn't make a difference to how the bank would continue to operate the very next day. And so she gives a couple of examples of that. In 2018, HSBC Holdings agreed to pay 101 million to settle a US criminal probe into rigging currency transactions. In 2018, they also South African Central Bank fined HSBC 15 million rand for weaknesses in its processing to detect money laundering. In 2020, HSBC told basically Australia, anti money laundering people, that it had failed to report thousands of transactions that had to do with money laundering. And we know Australia was involved in the money laundering for Operation Gladio, because if you remember from the book we read about Operation Gladio specifically, it talked about Nugent Hand, the bank. It was specifically set up to money launder for Operation Gladio. And Nugent, one of the co-owners, was found dead in his Mercedes when they started looking into it. So that just kind of ties in that HSBC has offices in Australia, because Australia is part of the British Empire as well. But it just shows you how all of these books work together, um, and basically are coming at things in a completely different way, but all end up at the same place. And that's why doing several of these and being able to piece them all together solidifies what we're finding. Okay. In December 2021, HSBC was fined 64 million pounds, which is about $85 million, by British regulators for failing in its anti-money laundering. It's just a freaking how many of these do we have to go through before you just go, "You know what? You're not a bank. You're a money laundromat." But alleged money laundering for terrorists and drug cartels was not all HSBC was up to. They announced in 1999 that it would purchase the Republic National Bank of New York for $10 billion, the biggest foreign takeover of an American bank in history. Now, why should you care about that one? Republic National Bank of New York was owned by a guy by the name of Safra, Safra. He is in all kinds of, we'll get to him in a second. He's a bad dude. We're just gonna say that at this point. Um, the purchase of Republic New York Corporation by HSBC would double the size of HSBC's private banking business. And this is very, very important. Banking industry analyst, excuse me, says it expands its highly profitable private banking operations, which for you and I is money laundering. Under a $72 a share agreement, HSBC is buying Republic New York Corporation and its affiliate company, Safra Republic Holdings. So basically, that guy's whole estate because they killed him. The parent of banks that serve clients in havens like Switzerland, Luxembourg, and Monaco. HSBC has grown aggressively out of its roots in the colonial Hong Kong and Shanghai bank, but it's still all about money laundering for drug ops. $10 billion purchase of, let's see, so the deal would surpass the previous record for a foreign takeover of American Bank, which was 10 billion for Bankers Trust by Deutsche Bank. And Deutsche Bank has been sanctioned multiple times for money laundering for drugs. Seeing a pattern here? It would also be HSBC's biggest purchase since it acquired Marine Midland Bank for $6 billion. A guy by the name of John Bond is HSBC's chairman, and he is quoted as saying, "The acquisition we have announced today will bring together two complementary private banking franchises. At the stroke of a pen, it doubles the size of our consumer banking operations in the US and doubles the size of our private banking around the world." Unquote. So basically, they're buying competitors in the money laundering business. Republic New York Corporation, which was the holding company for Republic National Bank of New York, Safra Republic Holdings, and Safra Republic Bank by HSBC, was the largest since the Midland Bank. HSBC was attempting to acquire Marine Midland Bank as early as 1979, but the New York regulatory body, this is very important, people, refused to permit it. Muriel Siebert demanded detailed accounting of the Hong Kong, Shanghai HSBC Bank, hidden profits, silent subsidiaries, and paraphernalia of money laundering, and refused the application when they failed to produce it. But do you know what happened? Paul Volcker, Federal Reserve Board, in order to consummate the takeover, it arranged for Marine Midland Bank, one of America's largest banks, to change from a state bank charter to a federal bank charter. And HSBC was then allowed to buy the bank. HSBC acquired 51% of the shares of the holding company in 1980 and full ownership in 1987. Marine Midland Bank was renamed HSBC Bank USA in 1999. I'm telling you, our entire federal government is corrupt. HSBC purchase of Republic New York Corporation was also not free of controversy. The company, controlled by the billionaire Edmund Safra, who was killed in a fire in his Monte Carlo home by his nurse Ted Maher, Maher. Y'all probably heard this story, but Mayer, Maher, was a he was in the military as a special forces Green Beret. Now, what's interesting about this, let's go back and just kind of look at this from a 30,000. We learned that a lot of the people that were trained, both in our military and other militaries in Fort Bragg, became part of Operation Gladio. That's just a fact. And what's interesting is the story behind this guy. If y'all haven't read this, I put a link up at the beginning. Y'all need to read the story because it's bizarre. Um, Everything about it, you can tell once the story started coming out, it kept changing. And this guy was eventually, this um, mayor guy was eventually convicted of murdering Safra and his nurse, Vivian, um, by locking them in their panic room, supposedly because there were invaders. Um, he ends up with a knife cut, um, but all of his security were Mossad. So his ex Mossad, there's no X, okay? So for whatever reason, he was a money launderer for the Mossad group of this money laundering garbage. And he was guarded by Mossad, but for some reason, they're all gone the night that this guy's murdered. So they either wanted him murdered. There's something fishy about this whole thing, and I suggest y'all look into it if you're interested. HSBC acquired the and this as soon as he was dead, HSBC got all of his shit. So just saying. Um, HSBC would go on making record bank acquisitions throughout the 90s and 2000s in France, Turkey, Mexico, China, Poland, Iraq, Taiwan, Brazil. A very interesting list because all of those people have something to do with the drug trade. In 2006, HSBC signed an agreement with a bank in Argentina, which we know is huge into opium and Operation Gladio, and basically bought the Argentina bank that had 58 branches throughout the country and had a full range of all of the um, private equity and all the other stuff that they're into. Despite HSBC being based in the city of London, to this day, HSBC reserves the right to, excuse me, to print Hong Kong money. Isn't that weird? Two other agencies also have the right, the Bank of China and a bank called Standard Chartered Bank, of which is also a British national bank. The Bank of China is the only one of the three that is a Chinese owned bank. In 2020, HSBC stocks plummeted when the Chinese government announced that the dope bank, HSBC, and Standard Charter would likely find themselves on the unreliable foreign entity list. They definitely should. London based Standard Charter Bank has been implicated in money laundering as well. That bank was caught in a 2013 sting, going so far as to offering out loud to launder money. I don't know how you do that. You publish a flyer, do you put it on your website? That's just crazy. Hong Kong has only returned b Hong Kong was returned back to China in 1997. Up until that point, obviously, it was a British, colony, if you will, and British ran all of the banks. Hong Kong was one of the center points for the international trade of opium and had been created and managed by the British Foreign Policy and Banking Institutes. 150 years of British colonial dope pushing in Hong Kong institutions would not be easy to get out of China. So we all thought that, and I mean, it's just like kind of like the whole Panama Canal. We all thought that Hong Kong going back to China was a really bad thing. I'm not so sure it was. Um, so John Henry John Temple, whose name is Lord Palmerston, he was the British Prime Minister in the middle 1800s, oversaw British First Opium War, which was 1839 to 42, as head of Britain's Foreign Office, and the Second Opium War, 1856 to 60, as British's Prime Minister, which I find very interesting. The Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, HSBC, was established in London as an outcome of the British colonial acquisition of Hong Kong and Shanghai after the Second Opium War. Its headquarters remained in Hong Kong, but officially moved to London in 1993, just 4 years before Hong Kong was going to be returned to China. Hong Kong and Shanghai had been in the possession of the British since 1842 after China lost the First Opium War. HSBC was created in 1865 to service the opium trade as a consequence of British winning the two opium wars against China. Britain's desire to enforce free trade of opium on China people after Britain had destroyed India's textile industry and forced it into a raw opium producer. India, in turn, would have no means of purchasing its required textiles from Britain, who now would have a world monopoly on the textile and cotton trade, except for selling opium to China. So they destroyed India's textile industry and made them grow poppy. India paid for its imported cloth from someone else and railway cars to carry the cloth and other British goods with the proceeds of the opium. Without the final demand of Chinese opium sales, the entire British trade structure would have collapsed. Britain Empire had made a move towards a free trade system, which was basically for everybody else, not for them. Or excuse me, a country had no right to intervene in its transaction. Protectionism, which had been practiced by Britain up until that point, had now been deemed unfit. Britain and all of the countries were naturally to follow along according to the new rules chosen for them, but excluding Britain. So Britain was still going to use protectionism, but everybody else had to be open to free trade for them. In 1600, Queen Elizabeth I created a royal charter for the East India Company. Its inception indistinguishable from the British Empire itself, rising to account for half of the world trade. Lord Macaulay said in a House of Commons speech in 1833, the East India Company had always been involved in both trade and politics, just as its French and Dutch counterparts had. Now, the best way to explain both the East and West British India companies is imagine a multi-country large plantation system. That's what the British Empire set up. India, Hong Kong, uh, Shanghai, and all of the Bahama um, islands on the West India side of the house, they were just large slave plantations under the ownership of London. They came with their own military. The East and West India companies hired mercenaries to administer their edicts within those territories. They were no different in your I'm a concept person. Every time I hear the word East India Company or West India Company, your immediate brain should picture a southern cotton plantation, regardless of what they're harvesting, whether it's opium or whatever. They're a slave plantation. That's what the entire two entities were. In the case of China, the trade of opium was ultimately banned by the Chinese, and severe punishments were delivered to those who smuggled the product into the country because, like today with fentanyl, they were being overwhelmed as and the British was using this as to keep them placated. It was all just like they're doing with us. The British Empire considered this a direct threat to its security, taking care of your people. It's a direct threat, which is why none of our leadership will do it here. So that's how they waged the first Opium War. They ended up with a treaty, and that's how they ended up with Hong Kong. Adam Smith wrote in The Wealth of Nations, the servants of the company have upon several occasions attempted to establish in their own favor the monopoly of some of the most important branches, not only of the foreign, but of the inland trade of the country. The policy of the English company would in this manner have probably proved as destructive as that of the Dutch. Nothing, however, can be more directly contrary to the real interest of these companies considered as sovereigns of the countries which they have conquered. The rent must necessarily be in proportion to the quantity and the value of the produce, and both one and the other must depend upon the extent of the market. So, in that time, the produce was opium. Lord Palmerston, the argument of Adam Smith about the virtues of free trade not only corresponded with British's real interests, but were intellectually unanswerable. They were formed on firm logic that simply could not be argued with. He also he goes on and basically is just lecturing that, the free trade is for everybody except for us because we're going to have our plantations and we're going to dictate how it all works. So there's a guy by the name of Jardine Matheson, and others fostered an endemic of opium trafficking into China. By the year of 1830, the number of chests of opium into China increased fourfold. A total of 7 million silver dollars entered China, while 56 million silver dollars were sucked out in opium trade. In 1830, opium was the largest commodity in world trade. In 1840, the Chinese emperor confronted the drug addiction crisis that was destroying the Mandarin class and nation. He tried to restrict the British trading companies, and that's when British went to war with them. So just like here, I'm telling you, and I've said this for a very long time, the war on drugs was a war against us, not the drug dealers, because the government is the drug dealers. Out of the Second Opium War, HSBC was founded in 1865 because now the trade has gotten so big, just like it does everywhere else. You got to have your bank on site. Just like HSBC got set up because the trade in Afghanistan was so big that they set that bank up in Pakistan next door. There's I didn't look this up, but there's an entity the author quotes a couple of different times at this point that's called DOPE, Dope Inc. And this is a quote: the Southern cotton and slave trade were run to a significant degree by the same Scottish based families that also ran the opium trade in the Orient. So there's a company by called Peninsular and Oriental Steam Navigation Company, which is a Scottish merchant, and they were involved in the Southern cotton, the slave trade to America, The Sutherland family, which was one of the largest cotton and opium traders in the South, was first cousins to the Matheson family of Jardine Matheson. The Barings, who founded the Peninsular Bering as in Barings, an Orient Steam Navigation Company that carried dope and had been the largest investors in the U.S. clipper shipping from the time of the American Revolution. The Rothschild family, as well as their later Our Crowd, um, New York banking cousins, the Lehmans, the Lehman brothers, all made their initial entry into the United States through the pre-Civil War cotton and slave trade. So this has a lot to do with the whole Civil War. I don't know if you guys have read any of the alternative explanations for the Civil War, but when Lincoln became president and wanted to get rid of the slavery in general, because the entire structure of what the imperialist, the fascist, had set up was slave plantations everywhere. It and they introduced drugs into their slave plantations in order to placate the people so they didn't rebel. So this is a vicious cycle, and I've done a lot more recently, recent reading into the fact, like I didn't know that the Russia had. So we talked about this a couple of podcasts ago. France and Britain had a vested interest in keeping the South in slavery because they were using the cotton as textile productions for their slave colony in India to churn out textiles for use in the European theater. So they actually had a secret plan to provide armaments to the South to defeat the North. Russia said, "No, you're not. And I'm going to send my navy to the west and east coast to prevent you from doing that." And that's probably the only reason why the Civil War turned out the way it did. We owe Russia that. The guys we hate. Um, so these people all have a vested long-term interest in hating Russia. And it goes much deeper than most of us will ever know. But Russia has been a thorn in their imperialistic side for a very long time. And this goes to that. And I don't know if y'all ever saw, I have a video on my Substack account that talks. I just stumbled across this. There's a couple of people I know that love doing genealogy. I do not. But one day I started clicking on the ancestors because I was doing the hidden history of the Bush family, that we're, putting out on, Substack in, kinda narrative form, and I just started going back and seeing how far and who all they were related to. Because we had also looked at FDR, and I found out that FDR was late related to, like, 22 of the 25 first presidents, which I'm like, "How's that happen?" So, I started clicking on the Bush, family, and I went back to when the Bushes came to America. The the last generation that was exclusively in England, that guy, it was a Walker, was a ship captain on a slave ship. That's what he made his, livelihood. He made his fortune shipping, slaves from one of the, western coasts of Africa to South Carolina, particularly from an area that dealt in rice in Africa. And that's the reason why South Carolina has rice plantation. I didn't know that either. Because those slaves particularly knew about growing rice in kind of boggy like areas. So, what was hilarious in hindsight is he was so awful. His crew killed him while they were at sea. They committed mutiny, um, and basically threw him overboard. Too bad we couldn't have done that to the ones that we know. Anyway, not that I'm suggesting violence, but I definitely think we should have mutinied, um, just the legal way. England and France, or England without France, if necessary, shall teach a lesson to those hordes that the name of Europe will hereafter be a passport of fear if it cannot be of love. That's Lord Palmerston speaking as Prime Minister about the Opium Wars. So he's basically saying, screw you. I don't care if you don't like what I'm going to do. We're going to use terror, passport of fear, if we can't love you enough to kill you with opium. These people are psychos. Barings Brothers, Barings, was the premier merchant bank of the opium traffic from 1783 to recent years. Boston families who were created out of the British opium trade are as follows: Cabots, Lodes, Lodes, Forbes, Cunninghams, Appletons, Bacons, Russells, Coolidges, Parkmans, Shaws, Codmans, Boylstons, Boylstons, and Runnewells, Runnywells. Dopey Inc. writes, quote, this group's leading banker became, at the close of the 19th century, the House of Morgan, which also took its cut in the Eastern opium traffic. Thomas Nelson Perkins, a descendant of the opium and slave shipping magnate who founded Russell and Company, became the Morgan's Bank chief Boston agent through Perkins' First National Bank of Boston. Morgan's Far East operations were officially conducted British opium traffic. William Straight, who spent the years 1901 to 12 in China as assistant for the notorious Sir Robert Hart, chief of the Imperial Chinese Customs Services, i.e., chief drug lord. Afterwards, he became head of the Morgan's Bank Far Eastern operations. Morgan Guarantee Trust, with the identified leadership of the British dope banks, Jardine Matheson's current chairman, 1992, David Newbigging, the most powerful man today in Hong Kong, is a member of the Morgan's International Advisory Board. The chairman of Morgan, the bank's international division, sits on the council of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, RIIA. And we know them because they're the counterparts to the CFR for London, and all ran by fascists. The chairman of Morgan Grenfell, in which Morgan Guarantee Trust has 40% stake, is Lord Cato, Catto. He sits on the London committee of the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, HSBC. One big happy family. Opium addiction entered the US in the 19th century as a direct consequence of Britain's foreign policy. British pharmaceutical houses had begun commercializing production of morphine from opium in the years leading up to the American Civil War. The British firms misrepresented morphine as non-addictive painkiller. Where'd we heard that before? They also had the audacity to push it as a cure for opium addiction. Some things never change. In 1911, the narcotics problem was addressed at an international conference at The Hague. The conference agreed to regulate the narcotics trade, with the goal in mind of eventually suppressing it. Nobody believes that. Early days of the dope trade, either opium nor morphine were considered illegal drugs. Heroin would not be outlawed as a prescription drug until 1924. against Britain's open diplomatic posture on behalf of the unrestricted profiteering of a commodity known to destroy its consumers. And you can make the argument one way or the other where you think regulation heightens the production or, when you make something illegal. I'm not going to argue the economics of it, but it's just hilarious that the same people that um, are doing this are the same ones that are now going to tell us that it's going to be illegal so that it's all put into the black market so that they can make more money off of it. So Hong Kong and Shanghai had the opium dens, and the author goes and talks about the whole black market production. Um, Dope Inc. says, quote, the operation of this scope could not exist without the political approval of the British government because it's just so big, nor without the gigantic supporting facilities of the world's offshore credit markets, the world's gold and diamond trade, and hands on management of the retail distribution or organized crime aspects of the operation. So if if you were to map, and I mean, I'm going to try to shorten some of this, but if you were to map the entire tr- uh, supply chain, if you will, like we do in everything else, map the supply chain of from the opium fields to the end user. You have to control every part of that. You don't leave any of that up for um, random administration because if you do, the entire thing falls apart. Because we know, just like in normal supply chains, if you don't own every aspect of it, like the truckers, in when they go on strike, your entire um, supply chain has a point of failure. When you're dealing in the black market, you don't leave points of failure open. You control it all. So the author in this Drug Inc. article talks about more specifically, it is an economic warfare operation. Two of its directors, J.H. Keswick of the family that founded Jordine Matheson in 1828 to trade opium, and J.K. Swire of the Swire family of hereditary opium traders, were senior officials in the Britain Ministry of Economic Warfare during World War II. Let that sink in. Another senior official of that ministry is Sir Mark Turner, the chairman of Rio Tinto Zinc, the HSBC partner in numerous fields, including gold operations. Turner is now a key figure in 1992 in the RIIA, which of course we know was founded by Lord Alfred Milner, who is the fascist of the Round Table. And Milner was an early chairman of Rio Tinto Zinc. So she's doing a great job of tying both the current day operators of the opium trade back to the original fascists that we talked about back in chapter 1. The Royal Institute of International Affairs, RIIA, and its leading personnel control not only the Far Eastern drug traffic, but every important dirty money laundering operation across the globe. A concise summary of RIIA's purpose appears to be de facto founding document. Cecil Rhodes, who we remember, who founded both the gold and diamond mining empire that still dominates the world today of Anglo-American De Beers, and also founded the dope trading Standard Bank in the African partner of the Asian bank called the Chartered Bank, has since merged, is the starting point for the present form of the disease. Rhodes left his wealth to the Rhodes Trust, administered by Lord Milner. Milner's collection of Oxford trainees, because Oxford is the what do you call that? Breeding ground, training ground. Milner, they refer to it as Milner's kindergarten, which of course is where Bill Clinton went. made up most of the 1916 Lloyd George government and formed the RIIA at a meeting in Versailles in May 30th, 1919. Rhodes' 1877 will is quoted as this: to establish a trust to and for the establishment and promotion and development of a secret society, the true aim and object thereof shall be the extension of British rule throughout the world, the perfecting of a system of immigration from the UK and colonization by British subjects of all islands wherein the means of livelihood are attainable by energy, labor, and enterprise, slave plantations, and especially the occupation by British settlers of the entire continent of Africa, the Holy Land, the valley of the Euphrates, the island of Cyprus and Candia, the whole of South America, the islands of the Pacific, not heretofore possessed by Great Britain, the whole of the Maclay archipelago, the seaboard of China and Japan, the ultimate recovery of the United States of America as an integral part of the British Empire, the consolidation of the whole empire, the inauguration of a system of colonial representation in the imperial parliament, which may tend to weld together the disjointed members of the empire, and finally, the foundation of so great a power as to hereafter render wars impossible and promote the best interest of humanity as long as they're in charge. So, right there is the charter of the New World Order. Right there is the father of the New World Order, Cecil Rhodes. And what he did was to secure the gold mines through the Boer Wars, the diamond mines, in order to monopolize wealth and to colonize all of Africa. This is the New World Order. This is the foundation. The RIIA and their sister organization, the CFR, are the sub-councils of that, and then you have all of the other committees that we're familiar with, the Club of Rome, the Committee of 300, blah, blah, blah. The secret society concept was passed on by Milner, Rhodes' successor, as the High Commissioner in South Africa through Milner's trainee, Lionel Curtis of the Round Table Group, and Lord Robert Cecil, originator of the League of Nations, which is where you got the concept of Israel as a homeland for Jewish people. Lord Robert Cecil, let's see, Curtis and Cecil both participated in the May Versailles meeting in 1919. The Royal Institute of International Affairs is the secret society that Cecil Rhodes called for. Although Wall Street has contributed greatly to this whole so that's that part of it. So we're going to do a little bit of a dig into the London. The city of London is over 800 years old. The 400, the last 400 years has been basically the financial center of the world. It's referred to as a square mile, simply the city, which is divided into 25 ancient wards with an alderman in charge of it. It is basically a corporation, and the analogies for those people, I know Inevitable ET 17 has done a deep dive into the corporation aspect of that a lot of people talk about in the United States. You can have an opinion of however you want about whether that's true or not, but when you realize that it basically duplicates what London is, the the similarities are striking. I'm just gonna say that. I'm not endorsing it, I'm just saying that listen to the way this one is set up. There was never a surviving charter, if you will. It was based on Magna Carta, um, by King John in 1215. The city of London shall have enjoy its ancient liberties The legal function of the corporation has never been questioned, reviewed, reevaluated ever, but rather it's been left to legally function according to its ancient liberties. The corporation is not actually under the jurisdiction of the British government, the largest financial center in the world, which is why people charter banks there because they're not under anybody's control. Kind of like what we were talking about, the Bank of International Settlements. It is its own entity, it has its own immunity, just like the bank at the Vatican. There is a pattern when it comes to these systems that they have set up and how they operate. The city has a separate voting system that allows for corporations to vote on how their separate government should run, not the people. The corporations are given a percentage of the vote based on how many people they have employed there. Um, so the position has been held. They have a position called the remembrancer, remembrance with an R on the end of it, who acts as a reminder, other people call him an enforcer, of the will of the corporation. He has direct communication with the royal family. Um, it's not an elected position. Paul Double, Double, has been in the position since 2003 as of the writing of this book. Mr. Double has the right to act as an official lobbyist. He sits right next to the Speaker in the House of Commons. He reviews all legislation. He's the only non elected person allowed in the House of Commons. The city is the only area in the country in which the number of workers significantly outnumber the residents, and therefore, to be truly representative of its population, they offered a vote to the organizations as opposed to the people. So, but the workers themselves, like I said, they don't have any say in it at all. And the author makes the note, um, if you feel like you just walked through Alice's looking glass, you wouldn't be alone. But what appears to be an absurd level of madness is it's been running the largest financial center in the world since the 1600s under the machinations of the British Empire. So then she goes on to talk about a different section on offshore banking. In World War II, colonization was meant to be done away with. And we thought that applied to the British Empire, but if you did, you'd be wrong. Countries were reclaiming their sovereignty, their independence, and as we saw with uh, the creation of Israel, some lost all of their sovereignty. The city of London was set up in what was called secret jurisdictions. They were to operate within the last remnants of the Britain's small territory colonies. Of Britain's 14 overseas territories, 7 are bona fide tax havens or secret jurisdictions. A separate international financial market was also created to facilitate the flow of this offshore money in euro-dollar markets. Since this market has its banks outside the UK and US, they're not under jurisdiction, so they can't be caught, quote unquote, money laundering or held accountable in whatever level of accountability, i.e., fines, because none of them are going to jail. Um, so I'm not even sure why that is relevant. The 1997, nearly 90% of all international loans were made through this offshore market in these secret places. What is often misunderstood about the City of London's offshore finances are not contained in a system of banking secrecy, but rather trust. And I don't know if y'all know how trusts work, but I did find this, and it is a good analogy if you don't know how that works. Um, Land trust are a way to buy real estate. There are other versions of it, but I'm going to talk about two. One is the state of Illinois, and one is in the state of Florida. They are the only two states that have land trust of this kind that I'm going to describe. If, as a real estate investor, I buy a property for a rental property and I want to limit my liability and I don't want people to know who I am. Um, I can buy it in the name of a land trust. You just make up a name, you assign a trustee. There's no qualifications to be a trustee. There's no qualifications or anything to be a beneficiary. It can be a land trust that goes into um, on forever because you can list subs like sequential beneficiaries. Like I can put my daughters, not that I have any, my grandkids, and so I can outline who those people are that's gonna be the beneficial interest in it. Can be multiple people, it can be 1, it can be successors, and you are not required by any court of law in Florida. As a matter of fact, it's prohibited that you can ever disclose the beneficiary page. It's always written on its own separate page. They can see the document and they can see who your trustee is, but they can't see who the beneficiary is. And so you can literally sell that document. And if the person wants to hold that document in a land trust, you can reassign the beneficial interest on its own form to the next person. And other than that person starting paying the property tax, no one would ever even know the property was sold. Now there's issues with that because you're supposed to, when you sell a property, pay doc stamps and the transfer as far as the title. But there are people that don't. I'm just going to say that. Not me. I do it right. But I hold all of my property in land trust because the it isolates your liability. If somebody gets hurt on your property, all the most they could ever get is that one property and the value of that property, not your entire portfolio. And we make jokes, the lawyer that, is kinda like the expert, in Florida for that, uh, said in the one real estate investment meeting I was in, that the reason why, Illinois and Florida are the only ones that have that is because of all of the mafia that was in Chicago money laundering into Miami, is they wanted that anonymity, and I have no doubt that's probably true. But if you think of that same, concept, that's how they do money laundering in trusts in offshore locations, that exact thing, because they remain anonymous. And I don't know if y'all have read anything about the New Zealand, and we know that a lot of people own property there, like it's gonna be the place everybody runs if there's some big deal. They all own all of their property in trust there. So it's very difficult if you don't have somebody on the inside to track who owns what in New Zealand. And that's the beauty of it. So where were we? Um, oh, so she's the next part of this is how they basically have fleeced some of the former British territories that were like, for example, in the African uh, continent. So this guy, John Christensen, who was an investigative economist, says that legal estimates that the capital that legally belongs to nobody, quote unquote, could amount to as high as $50 trillion that are located in British territories under these tax haven slash trusts. That's a lot of dough. So according to the same guy, the combined external debts of sub-Saharan African countries was 177 billion in 2008. However, the wealth that these countries elites have moved out of those countries that were former British colonies between 1970 and 2008 was estimated at 944 billion, 5 times their foreign debt. This is not only dirty money, this is also stolen money from the resources and productivities of these economies. He says, quote, far from being a net debtor to the world, sub-Sahara Africa is a net creditor to offshore finance. And that's a beautiful way of looking at it. To put it in context, the backwardness of Africa is not due to the inability to produce, but rather that it has been experiencing uninterrupted looting from the first days that it was colonized. African countries then need to borrow money because they've taken all of the capital out of those countries. And of course, these same people are more than happy to lend them money at high interest rates. These countries have been looted twice because they're left with that debt and none of the resources that they naturally had. Developing countries lose $1 trillion every year in capital flight and tax evasion. Most of this wealth goes back to the UK and the US through these offshore havens and allows their currency to stay afloat. The very economies of the UK and US have also been gutted because our wealth, through foreign wars and all of that other stuff, has been being bled off as well. Banks are not interested in putting their money into industry and manufacturing. They put their money into real estate speculation, financial speculation, and foreign currency trade, which basically breaks down the middle class, which is their goal. Okay. The UK has by far the highest rate of drug overdoses in all of Europe, in at 31%, followed by Germany at 15%. The UK consists of one-third drug overdoses that occur in all of Europe. So 33% of all, um, 31% of all drug overdoses in Europe happen in the United Kingdom. Wonder why that is. Oh, because they're the granddaddies of the drug trade. The average family income in UK has is presently at around £28,000. The poverty rate is about 20%. And then the author says one of the she uses Detroit because Detroit was the like industry center at one point, says that it has a family income of 26,000 and a poverty rate of 34%. So that kind of is like the explanation point at the end of this, in what damage has been done, all of the drug overdoses and the stealing of our, wealth, and I can't argue with her on that point because that is absolutely right. Um, you can't destroy America, in an overt, um way, so they're definitely gonna do it in a covert way. So, let's see what we got here as far as the, um, comments, that's where Russia came in. Um, oh, and that's a very good, comment about the greenbacks because that was when Lincoln yeah, you're right. Um, that was part of the where Lincoln introduced the greenbacks as a way to strip the central bankers of their power, and some argue that's why he got shot, that it was all about the money. Um, so that's what I got today. I want to thank you for hanging in there with me with our audio issues. And I'm glad that we got through that because that did a nice job of kind of tying it all together. Um, and I really think it's so important when you have, as we know they're out there, the doubters on one aspect or the other of what's happening, and how Operation Gladio fits together, that you have a different author like Cynthia that comes from a completely different angle, presents completely new facts, and yet it as if it's a ladder and you could visualize the ladder going up to the answer and the enlightenment of everybody. One author, Paul Williams, is going to be the left rung on that ladder, and Cynthia can be the right rung, but about every 12 inches, you've got a crossover into each other's findings that literally ties it together and allows you to be able to say, this is in fact validated. It's validated from multiple different aspects of it, and it all fits together like a jigsaw puzzle. Um, so I think going through several of these books and showing where those cross ties are by the names of people, the names of organizations, um, and I really do. I can't remember who it was that mentioned it about tying in Whitney Webb's The Blackmail of America. When we go back and we look at some of those things, which I do think after we do the summaries of a couple of those other books, um, the highlights of them, because I'm not going to do another in depth one on Gladio at this point, because I think we've got the gist of what it is. Um, I do want to use something like Whitney Webb's Blackmail of America because it uses BCCI. It talks about all of these people that have been killed in these different, what I now will label as Operation Gladio events. And I really do think that it will give us the opportunity to apply our lessons learned, if you will, our new um, knowledge in a way that sees something that's occurred during our lifetime in a completely different light, and I would love to work through that with y'all. And her book is not only so educational as to what the real world is, it talks about the Inslaw affair, and so it's just gonna tie so many pieces together that I just think it would be a fun exercise, to walk through with everybody. So, we are definitely gonna do that. So, we only have a couple of chapters left in this book. We will finish that up probably by the end of the weekend, maybe the beginning of next week. I'm gonna take a few days, so that I can put together a couple of summaries for us of the other 2 books, which goes very in depth into specific countries and the Gladio operations in them, because I've got some highlights I wanna share with you, one of which happened, in one of the Scandinavian countries that is mind-blowing, because it gives us a completely different way of looking at current events, um, and I will show you how that same scenario has been used several times, because I'm of the mind now in looking at several of these different countries that they have a very limited playbook. And once we know the playbook, we're going to be much better at what we do. Um, so that's kind of a sketch of where we're going from here. So I will see you next time, which I think is tomorrow, and we'll move on from there. Thanks for everybody for being here. I really appreciate it. And don't forget, later today, I will be doing an interview with War Hamster, and I will let all of you know when it gets posted. I'm really looking forward to that. So enjoy the rest of your day.